Good morning, Daniel.
Happy New Year, Dan.
Hey, Happy New Year. What's on our agenda for the first podcast of the new year?
I want to start by talking about some differences. So, planning for large gaps in spouses' ages, kind of bridging the gap on maybe spouses' different risk tolerances, and then follow or finish it up with talking about how to get clients to actually follow up on advice that we give them.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, spousal age gaps. I'm a product of a spousal age gap, so very familiar with the subject. So where do we want to start?
Yeah, so I think financial planning can feel a little bit more straightforward when there's two spouses. They have more or less the same age. They both want the same things. They make roughly the same, and their goals are aligned, and as are their values. That's rarely the case, we find, right? Life is a lot messier and not nearly as neat and clean as that. One of the things we see that can make this a little bit less clean per se is just meaningful differences in two spouses' ages. So maybe the husband is 10 years older than the wife or the other partner, and vice versa, and that can create some unique planning dynamics and shifts in kind of how you approach a plan. So first and foremost, we see large spousal age gaps from time to time, and people know it makes planning a little bit more difficult, but I don't think they know exactly what planning differences that requires. So when we see maybe large gaps in spouses' ages show up in plans, I guess what considerations do these bring up that maybe folks aren't thinking about?
So I think there's a couple of things that go into this. I think first and foremost, we wanted to talk about maybe the most common version of this. It is very common in our society to see a slightly older male spouse and a slightly younger female spouse, and there's a whole sociological conversation we could have about why that happens. But boiling down to it, you might see something innocuously small, 1 or 2 year age gaps. Sometimes you see 5 or 6 year differences. I think we've seen more than 10 years, more than once or twice. But in those dynamics, there's a couple things happening here. First and foremost, different ages means different stages of career, means different earning potentials or probable earning potentials, and also means different time horizons for quote unquote appropriate retirement ages. And there's no fixed rule here, right? But a lot of people are targeting like a 60 or 65 retirement. And the bigger the age gap, the bigger the potential issue where somebody might be in their peak earning years and the other spouse might be lining up ready to retire. So it can become an issue where it not only becomes a household impact, but also a career impact, and not necessarily based on the person who's being impacted's age, but the person who is reaching that particular age sooner than later.
Before we even get into maybe some of the technical planning considerations here, I liked what you said. Maybe some of the social norms or differences when there is a bigger gap. Are there any that you want to share, or even things that or maybe things I'm not even thinking of, right? Because me and my partner are the same age. I don't know what it would be like if I was dating somebody 10 years older or younger than me.
Well, I mean, again, there's all sorts of interpersonal things that go on there. I don't know that we really need to get into that part too much, but I think there can be different societal pressures, just based on sort of traditional norms versus not being a traditional norm, right? It's not that there's one particular path that's going to be quote unquote better or easier or right or wrong, but there's a certain set of problems that comes with a older husband, younger wife. There's a certain set of problems that comes with a older wife, younger husband, and if we get into LGBTQ relationships, then there's a whole different mess that sort of happens there. So there can be kind of major issues one way or the other. I still think the core measurement here really is just the age gap, and then gender norms, societal norms is secondary just to the age issue itself.
Okay, so not a purely financial question, but let's say we have a spousal age gap, um, 10 years for the example. In your conversations, do you tend to find that people want to retire at the same time, or it's more of a, hey, look, I worked for 30, 40 years. I want the other spouse to do it as well, and I'm going to be retired for a decade before they kind of step away?
I think I see three versions of this, and I hate to say it, the summary here is going to be an it depends, but the three versions sort of covers your it depends. Most couples seem to have already made a decision about this before they talk to us, right? It's part of their relationship dynamic. Hey, you're older than me. How are we going to deal with that one day? And that was maybe part of their dating conversation or their early marital conversations, but lots of different reasons that can come up. In particular, what I see as the three versions here are either A, your retirement is not going to impact mine at all, right? You're going to retire when you retire. I'm going to retire when I retire. Option B, your retirement is going to accelerate my retirement. All right. And then probably the rarest, but maybe one of the most interesting ones is even though you're older, I'm going to retire first. That's one that we've seen maybe a surprising amount. Maybe we have a sample bias here in Longmont. But we have many clients. We've talked to many people where there is a spouse working into their mid or late 60s and a already retired spouse in their 50s. And this tends to be roughly correlated with higher income folks, people who've done really well in their careers, where maybe one of them really just didn't need to work, and so it just became sort of a, hey, you don't have to work, and they said great, and so then one of them still worked to a traditional age, and the other one just kind of got to retire early. Doesn't mean they weren't productive or busy or helpful in a different way, but those are sort of the three versions we see. What I don't often see is a version where somebody says, you are going to work as long as I work, and I'm going to work as long as you work. Where somebody, gets to, older spouse gets into their 70s, younger spouse gets into their 60s. I think I can think of one case where I've seen that being what's happening.
It's interesting. Like, how would you approach a situation? And I feel like we see this from time to time where, as you mentioned, right, they come in with an idea of what they want things to look like already. And that's a touchy subject. It's not on us to instill our values and preferences on them. But what would you do if, a mutual client, right? So both partners can retire, but the younger one is continuing to work, right? Would you kind of push them towards, hey, look, you don't need to work. You're doing this because maybe you want to, but the two of you could both step away in full. Or you kind of just, take them at their word when they say, well, I want to keep working and whatnot. How do you approach that?
I'm actually quite familiar with this particular circumstance on a personal level because I think this is going to be what it looks like for Caitlin and I one day. I have no intention of retiring before I'm about 70, even though I probably could retire now or very soon if I chose to. I think the basic answer that comes with this is saying, if what makes you happy is being busy, being productive, or you're passionate about your work, you're passionate about the impact you make in the world, it's not my job as your financial planner to tell you, like, cut it out. Life's too short. You got to do something else. But I think it puts an emphasis on, hey, particularly when there's an age gap, you might still be passionate about your career in your early 50s, your late 50s, as your partner maybe is in their early 60s, late 60s. And I think you just want to say, look, two things can be true at once. You can still be happily working, but your partner is going to reach an advanced age sooner than later. And so let's stay focused on your career and do all the stuff that's making you happy. But let's also make sure we're taking the time and carving out the opportunities to do those things that they would want to do in their early retirement. And, so you're just going to take longer vacations, more vacation, more time off. And let's balance that with your career ambitions. But let's not say, well, sorry, I'm still working, so we'll get there when we get there. Because through no fault of their own, right, as time passes on, they may not have the same health or they may not still be with us in time for your time to retire and have those experiences for yourself. So I think it's that sort of, living for today and saving for tomorrow mentality. Same thing here. One partner has saved for tomorrow and they've reached tomorrow. You're still living today, but let's just try to balance the work and the personal life elements.
You bring up a good point there, which I think kind of leans into some of the more technical aspects of this planning consideration is hey, look, if one of your spouses, usually the male, right, is a decade or so older than you statistically, men live, on average, a shorter amount of time than women. And if they're already retired and you plan on continuing to work for a decade or half a decade, like that is, getting them closer to their potential passing age. And that is something that people do just need to consider. I guess when it comes to the actual financial planning part of it, right, and getting into maybe some of the numbers and planning considerations there, right, average life expectancy is a big one, especially if the male is older than the female. There's a huge likelihood, especially if there is an age gap, that the female spouse will outlive the male by a wide margin. I guess in addition to that, like, what about things like Social Security? How do we approach items like that when maybe both spouses have been working their entire life, but one is half a decade to a decade older than the other one?
So I think the big thing there is going to really hone in on how balanced or imbalanced Social Security benefits are. So you presented a hypothetical earlier in the conversation about, we're relatively equal spouses in age and earnings and all this sort of stuff. If we just extend that and we now have our age gap conversation happening, I think a really key question is going to be, right, did we have relatively even earnings over our careers, or was there a substantial difference? There can be a weird circumstance where the older spouse did not do as well as the younger spouse in their career. And so, in that type of scenario, that's going to put some weight on, hey, just claim Social Security when it's the right time for you, at full retirement age, 66, 67, whatever it is. Delay to 70 if the younger working spouse is earning enough to really max out that lifetime benefit. But in turn, if we have maybe call it traditional, and I use that term loosely here, but where the older spouse has had a better career and has earned more and so on, then in that scenario, I think it is more meaningful and impactful to look at the spousal benefit, where if the spousal benefit or the survivor's benefit is going to be substantially greater than the younger spouse's anticipated benefit at full retirement, then it behooves us to ensure that we are delaying further into the Social Security claiming window, right? Getting closer to 68, 69, 70. So that way the lifetime benefit of the younger spouse is more strongly enhanced by that higher earning and coincidentally older spouse's benefit.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And this is one of those things too, right? Like what other accounts are out there come into play? What is the health of the two respective spouses? Maybe some of like their family health as well, right?
Well, and health can be a big factor, and that gets really just into the classic claiming conversation, because then the age gap is less of the problem, and life expectancy is the core thing, and age is not driving it. If we have classic things like cancer, Lou Gehrig's ALS, dementia, Alzheimer's in the family, that might not only push claiming decisions earlier, but also might push retirement decisions earlier, living for today type decisions earlier. I think there's a lot of things that come into play there when you don't anticipate living into your 80s, your 90s, or past 100.
Okay, well, on that subject matter, longevity risk, right? I think that's an important one when there is a decade difference potentially. I keep saying decade just because it's easy for the conversation. When it comes to longevity risk, right? Outliving your money. How does a large difference in two spouses' ages kind of play into this a little bit?
It really magnifies not only just the duration of retirement conversation and enhances the necessity that the younger spouse keep working to close their own age gap between their retirement date and their eventual demise, not to put it too darkly. But also, it really actually puts a light on the relationship between the spouses and their priorities based on age. I think a real risk that can occur between spouses with substantial age gaps is a perception of our impact on the world. So imagine, let's say you are 85 and your spouse is 75. You have already lived up to or a little bit past your actual life expectancy. Your spouse is still, 5 to 10 years shy of their life expectancy, and you, the older spouse, start having these like, what difference have I made in the world? What are people going to remember me for? What can I still do while I'm here? And this can provoke or prompt a charitable inclination, right? Where I'm going to be more philanthropic. I'm going to give gifts to friends, family, charities, all that sort of stuff, and that's great. But that could come at the real expense or risk of the younger spouse, right? If you're up here going like, well, I'll be gone soon, so I want to make sure I do everything I can while I'm still here, and your younger spouse is like, I'm not going to be gone soon, then that can create a real risk that you might give away assets or spend assets, right, on your final days, as it were, to make a difference before you're gone, and put your younger spouse at great risk. The same thing really happens with long-term care planning, right? It's one thing if we're both of about the same age, we both might need to move into long-term care situations around the same time. It's very different if one of us might move into long-term care 5, 10, 15 years earlier than the other, particularly if we have not adequately insured that risk.
All right. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. The long-term care is a big one. I mean, we touch on long-term care in general a lot. I think it puts a little bit more importance, if you agree, just on planning against that risk, because it typically depletes a considerable amount of household wealth. And if there's a scenario in which older spouse needs long-term care, younger spouse is 8 years younger, all of a sudden spouse B doesn't have nearly as much to live the rest of their life, plus the long-term care they might potentially need as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are safe harbors for spouses, but we're talking about less than $200,000 in capital liquid assets. We're talking about primary residence only. And then this brings in questions of, is the home paid off? Do we have a mortgage, right? Do we have just Social Security, or do we have pension income? Because then there's a big balance issue of, if I've got a lot of recurring undepletable income from pensions, annuities, Social Security, that's great. But if I was just a super duper heavy 401k saver and I'm required to spend my assets down to this nominal level for a retiree, then I might be essentially living in abject poverty compared to somebody who had more of an annuitized stream of income in retirement. So then that brings in the dynamic of, what was our savings and accumulation strategy, and what are the risks we're taking on in how we build wealth and how we decumulate wealth in retirement.
All right. Well, staying on the spouses conversation, bridging the gap on risk tolerance, right? So just, I guess for simplicity's sake, right? Risk tolerance, thinking of it as, an investor's ability to live or, tolerate a certain level of risk in their portfolio, right? So things go up, things goes down. How much can you tolerate that, and to what extent can you, be comfortable with market fluctuation? The question becomes, I guess, one spouse maybe is averse to risk, and the other spouse is inclined to take on considerably more risk. I guess when we see a scenario where there's a wide gap in risk tolerance, how do we start to approach this conversation and plan for this with the two respective spouses?
This is going to be a bit of a controversial statement, but I think it helps to frame how I'm going to want to discuss this. My controversial statement here is that risk tolerance is kind of fictitious. In particular, just because there's not a lot of academic research or literature around it that shows that you can, reliably get people to sort of give the same answers under all seasons, all conditions, etc. And also, there's a lot of questions about the empirical validity of the measurement tools. So I just want to kind of put that over the conversation here, because you're going to hear me discuss this with a degree of sort of dismissiveness or skeptiveness, whatever the word is, right? But the primary thing here being, I just want to throw out there, as we talk about risk tolerance, there is such a thing as risk tolerance, but you're going to hear me be a little bit squishy on how we want to talk about how we deal with that. So with that framing out of the way, I think the primary thing that I look at as a financial planner before I think about even the individuals is, what does the plan demand? Right? What is the actual thing that needs to be accomplished in terms of our savings rates and our rates of return and so on for this plan to have a statistically high probability of success? So that's just going to be sort of the baseline that we have to deal with. And then from there, we now get into your hypothetical. What if there's a big difference in the client's self-perception of their risk tolerance? That's going to be the thing that drives it more than their individual piece, is going to be, does their plan work? And then once their plan can work, now we can start to move the dials on how risk averse or aggressive we are with our investments.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there. I think first, right, risk tolerance questionnaires and trying to understand someone's ability to tolerate fluctuations in the market is tricky, right? I think it's Mike Tyson who says something like, you don't know how you'll react until you get punched in the mouth, sort of thing. It's kind of the same with risk tolerance. We ask clients these questions typically: what would you do if the market declined 20%? A, nothing; B, change everything; C, something in the middle, right? And we're supposed to, from that, more or less figure out where someone fits on that spectrum. But the reality is, until someone actually sees $1 million go to 700,000, it's hard to understand how you will react when put in that situation. It sounds like what you're saying is, I don't want to say that doesn't matter, but what we should be instead focusing more of our time and efforts on is not how much will you put up with versus not, but instead, how much risk does your plan actually require you to take on, and then use that as more or less like the North Star for conversations.
Yeah, and we could have a whole conversation here about retirement income style. It's a concept created by Wade Pfau in his research on how couples sort of combine their desire for a style of retirement income and also their tolerance for risk, their tolerance for uncertainty. We can make that a future conversation if we want to get into those. But effectively, that really is the North Star: is what can the plan tolerate, what can we deal with, and then let's assume that whatever risk tolerances we're talking about in this couple that have a difference in tolerances, let's assume that both of their tolerances will be adequate. Let's move past the will the plan work part of this and say, okay, let's assume the plan will work if we're aggressive or we're conservative. In that particular situation, then my second rule is going to be, well, I personally, as a financial planner, I'm going to recommend, whether they take this recommendation or not, it's its own question. But what I'm going to recommend is that we build a portfolio and align our finances in such a way that it is not taking on any more risk than is necessary to adequately fund our objectives. Because that's just sort of a question here about, okay, is our goal to make a lot of money, die with a lot of money, etc., or is it to have enough money to live the quality of life that we are seeking to live and to complete and accomplish the things in life that we are hoping to complete and accomplish? And I think if that's the framing that we're using for it, that's going to be a much healthier way to approach it than it is going to be if we're just trying to, try to get the most out of our money and then we're just going to die with a pile of cash left over.
All right, well, let's play around with that a little bit. Like, what if, spouse A is like, cool, that's great. This more conservative allocation allows us to do everything we want. But spouse B says, that's great, but if we were slightly more aggressive, we'd get everything we want and could do even more. Not we'll die with more. I like seeing the numbers go up, but instead of taking the 2 vacations we desire per year, now we might be able to take 3. How do you kind of, reconcile the differences when maybe one spouse is comfortable with what that provides them and spouse B agrees that it provides them everything they've desired, but there is always the opportunity to do a little bit more, right? Join the second country club, buy the second car that you didn't really dream of, but yet now you have the chance to buy.
I think that's where we return to the risk capacity conversation. And it's a little bit of that framing around, again, like what is the adequate level of risk and return to accomplish the plan? But it's actually using that as the stepping off point, saying, okay, in our initial conversations, you said it was a big objective of yours to spend at least, 2 months out of the year overseas, traveling, seeing the world. And you're proposing that we be a little bit more aggressive. And if we could do that, maybe we could afford to spend 3 months. Would it make sense for us to dial a certain portion of your finances to the exact level of risk return required to target having that baseline 2 months, and then to accept putting another portion of our money at risk or at greater risk to potentially have that 3 months experience such that we are almost guaranteed to have the 2 months or have a very high confidence that we're going to have the 2 months. And then if the 3 months happens, great. And if the opposite happens, if the market's bad, if the investments don't work out, etc., it doesn't put the 2 months part at risk. Is that a reasonable way to balance it? Right. So it's just saying, look, what is necessary, what is required, and then what would be nice to have, and bifurcating our risk decisions between those 2 gradients.
Okay. What about, we're talking a lot about like stock market investing and investment management, but what about spouse A has a job, stable job, say they're a doctor, and then say spouse B is also a doctor, but spouse B, likes to push the levers a little bit more and has the opportunity to, per se, buy into a practice that is objectively, I'd argue, a riskier decision with potentially more upside. How do you consider that? Because, there's a scenario where more likely than not, these 2 doctors, if they just worked stable jobs, would be able to do everything they seek out to do, right? Vacations, college education, etc. But spouse B wants to buy into this business, which is a riskier decision, and maybe spouse A doesn't feel as comfortable with that level of risk and putting things on the line, but spouse B wants to do it and feels comfortable doing so.
I think there's actually a bit of a false framing here, and it's not your fault. It's just that we're talking about risk and kind of investment terms. But I want to bifurcate your hypothetical here into, let's say, buying into a practice that they work in and will function in, versus, we'll just call it an investment opportunity, right? It's not my practice, it's a friend's practice, or it's my uncle's motorcycle shop. Like, it doesn't actually matter what it is, but just a key difference between a career decision of going from employee to equity holder versus saying, I will still be an employee and still work my career and job, but I'm just going to make a really risky investment. I think in the equity scenario, that's really more of a life goals conversation than it is it's a financial planning conversation, but I think it's more about what do I want out of life than it is a financial decision, even though it is fundamentally a financial decision. And in turn, right, when it's my uncle's motorcycle shop, then I think it's more of a, can we afford to lose this money, right? So I like to use the framing of, would you be willing to put the same amount of money through a paper shredder? I've used that framing to talk about speculative investments, crypto, small businesses, currency exchanges, crazy wild hair ideas at a client once who wanted to buy into like a cold fusion startup, like all sorts of stuff where it's like, look, if you could afford to put the same amount of money through a paper shredder and it's not going to put your life at risk and your future at risk, then functionally it's fun money to some extent. And if you want to take a Hail Mary bet, go for it. I think it's very different if the question here is, hey, do we take out a second mortgage on the house to buy into this business or make this investment? That's a very different risk conversation because that's not money you can really afford to lose necessarily, or it's going to have a huge negative impact. That's where it really is a both parties need to be comfortable with this decision conversation, because otherwise it will not only be a problem, if it goes south financially, it will likely cause a huge relationship problem as well.
Sure. No, I agree. I think it's more of a lifestyle decision that has financial implications than it is a financial decision that has lifestyle implications, right? Like take spouse B doesn't start the business because spouse A is so against it. You could see a scenario pretty easily where there's just some resentment between the two of them. So I think, focus on the life part of that conversation first, and then see how that impacts the finances, and if it is something that is, a reality that can be pursued. I guess like to close this out, like when two spouses do have different risk tolerances. Going back to maybe the first topic, let's say they have different risk tolerances and an age gap. Are there considerations there that need to be talked about, or is it simply more or less the same thing? What is the capacity for risk in the household, and what's the easiest way and path of least resistance to kind of get there?
I think the basic thing there is that you build the plan around their individual needs in that case. And you say, look, we're a household, we're a couple, we're a family, we're going to live the rest of our lives together in a perfect world. So with that in mind, here's how we build that plan. But we need to make sure that this plan works for both of you, right? One of you is going to have some working years and some flexibility. One of you is not. So with that in mind, let's make sure that the one who doesn't have the flexibility is taken care of. But in so doing and taking care of them, that the person who's younger, who's more likely to be quote unquote left behind at some point, is not put in jeopardy, where they sort of self-sacrificed to support and provide for the older one and then been left with nothing. So in that case, it's about looking at the portfolio, looking at the spending, looking at the objectives, and saying, great, what portion of this is necessary for the older spouse? What portion of this is necessary for the younger spouse? And then back to risk capacity. Does that work? Does the plan function? If it functions, great. If it doesn't function, what needs to be adjusted? And that's actually the thing we didn't talk about is what if the plan doesn't work based on our risk tolerance? How do we deal with that? But, functionally, at the end of the day, can this plan work for not just one of the partners, but both of the partners?
Yeah, I think early on we kind of said, let's assume the plan does work. Mm-hmm. But for 1 second, let's assume it doesn't, right? Would you ever just say, hey, look, I think you two should split the finances up given either the large age gap or the huge difference, in risk tolerances and what's needed? Or is there other considerations or maybe recommendations when a plan doesn't work in these contexts you'll provide?
Yeah, I mean, if the plan is not going to work, we have to just talk about the levers that are available, right? So if the plan is not going to work based on our current savings, our current rates of return, our current spending, and our current time horizon, then we have to decide which one of those we're willing to change. Are we willing to work longer? Are we willing to save more? Can we afford to save more? Are we willing to spend less? Can we manage to spend less? Or are we willing to take more investment risk? And that particular one is a big deal because unlike saving more or working longer, that one is probably the least in your control. You can only dial up your anticipated rate of return at the cost of a greater range of variability in your returns. So with that in mind, right, saying, well, we'll dial up the risk goes back into this risk tolerance conversation, and also is the one that has potentially the highest potential for the I told you so conversation, particularly where that difference in risk tolerance exists. So the first thing is just to put all those levers on the table and say, look, we can push or pull any of these levers to accomplish the outcome, but we have to make a decision about which it is. And then if there's a strong difference in preference, right, one of us has all the risk tolerance in the world, one of us has none of the risk tolerance in the world, it's just getting ahead of the future I told you so conversation, because there's only one of two outcomes we can expect here. Either the markets will cooperate in the right time horizon in the right way, and the person who took on the risk will have so much more money and will be able to say, see, you were such a scaredy, and it was so silly of you to do that, but don't be a dick about it, you're just lucky. And vice versa, right? One of you might be very risk averse and want to have pensions, annuities, guarantees, and that's fine. And if the market doesn't cooperate for the more aggressive spouse, then once again, that person can say, well, look at you took all these dumb risks and you lost all your money, and I was the smart, responsible one. there's no right or wrong thing here because we don't actually control the variable, which is what happens in the market over that time period. So it's just acknowledging one of us is going to be right. Let's make sure we can live with whichever outcome there is. And it's not about which one of us was right. We're just happy that the plan worked regardless of what happened.
Yeah, that's well said. There's no right, there's no wrong. There's just, being able to achieve the things you seek out to achieve, and that's that. So I think that's a good way to close it up. I want to finish up with this last topic: how to actually get folks to, you know, follow through and implement on advice provided. And I know in the past we've talked about topics, kind of adjacent to this one, things like people's just capacity and bandwidth for tasks, and not even just finance, just in general, right? How much stuff can be put on one's plate before they feel overwhelmed or just stop doing things altogether. Everybody has a breaking point and a point in which they stop doing things, and it's different for everybody, and I get that. But whether, someone's version of success and implementation is logging into an account this month, or it's, getting the budget and everything automated, it's investing the accounts, and it's considerably higher in terms of productivity. There's no right, there's no wrong, right? Positive actions moving you toward your goals, revisited consistently over time at a pace that feels manageable, is success for everybody, regardless of what that actually looks like. But that being said, like I feel and I've seen, there's a lot of urgency tied to emotion, and when somebody has a real life event, that kind of scares them, right? Whether it's someone they know and love that had a health event, and they say, okay, cool, now I'm finally ready to get the insurance in place, or whether the market tanks and they say, okay, fine, let's finally decide to make the investment changes you recommended. Whatever the thing is, like it does seem like there's a lot of emotion that kind of gets people to move. But then there's other people who just do the thing when you show them the thing. Why do you think like following through is the hardest part of financial planning, right? At least in my opinion, it tends to be. Even when like the advice is mutually agreed upon to be sound and improve their finances.
I think the basic answer here is it's no different than proper diet and exercise, right? Everybody knows that eating green leafy things is generally good for you. That you should probably eat less than you do, snack less than you do. Nobody on earth should drink, right? We just know that alcohol is just universally not good for us. And yet, right, we snack, we drink, we do all sorts of things like that. Exercise, we know we should be moving our bodies, being active an hour, 2 hours a day, getting outside, getting sunshine, being busy, lifting weights, running, whatever it is. And plenty of us find reasons to hit the snooze button and never make it to the gym. There's just a difference between knowledge and efficacy, right? And I can know that this is going, people know they shouldn't smoke. Smoking is going to kill them. Doesn't mean that they'll stop, right? And they'll know that before they start, and it doesn't mean that they won't start. And so I think the basic thing here is just that you have to really respect that we can rationally know things, but that we are still animals on a certain level, and that we need emotional drivers, or we need emotional significance to create that locus of control that pushes behavior forward.
Okay, so in a client conversation, you don't want to be a pushover, right? This is the fifth time I'm having this conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Client, and you've told me, oh, I know, I should do that, and you don't want to be accepting to the point where you, as the advisor, just say, okay, yeah, well, we'll revisit this in 3-4 months, and that'll be great, and expect it. I do get there's a healthy medium there, but how do you start to employ some level of emotion to kind of create the urgency for something that can mutually be agreed upon is good for them, assuming, of course, like there aren't real things that are preventing them from doing this, multiple deaths in the family, illness, health concerns, right? Just like let's assume general busyness is the excuse here.
Yep. I think the first thing is we have to get back to the actual agreement. It's easy for people to smile and nod, right? And just say like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So I think you have to have an iterative conversation about that. And the first question is, does it make sense, right? Basic question, Mr. and Mrs. Client, my friend, my brother, parent, whoever I'm talking to, because this doesn't have to be professional. This can just be people in your life, right? My spouse. Do you agree that it would be beneficial if we did this thing? Right, save more money, started that college fund, increased contributions to the 401k, got money out, out of our giant checking account and some of it into the market, whatever it is. Do we agree that'd be beneficial? And we're really looking for resistance here, or we're looking for sort of rote agreeability, which is somebody just being like, yep, sure, okay, let's, but do we really agree, right? If we can agree and truly agree that this is going to be beneficial for us, Do we agree that this would be a reasonable timeline for that? Right. And reasonable could be this week, this month, this quarter, by the end of this year, whatever it is. And you need to know your audience here. Don't just make up dates and times and just see what happens, right? Know how busy they are and try to account for that. Say like, well, I know you're doing a lot right now, but would it be reasonable for us to get this done a week after this busy stuff is over? Sure. Okay. Now that we've agreed that it makes sense, now that we agree that this is a reasonable time frame, can we agree that if it doesn't get done by this time, that this is an appropriate recourse, right? So this could be something like, if you don't do it by this time, then I'm going to do something, right? If you don't do it by this time, or if we don't get this done by this time, then we're going to delegate this to somebody. But we're going to have a trigger that essentially is going to result in the outcome happening the way it should. So I'll give you a real world example here. We have clients that we meet with, and we've met with them for years, and we have this ongoing conversation where they are saving as much as they could possibly save, investing as much as they could possibly invest, and that's terrific for a financial planner. But they don't need to save that much. They don't need to invest that much. They just don't know what else to do with their money, so they're just saving and investing it. And so we've had this ongoing conversation where we've said, look, you could fly first class, you could take more trips, you could vacation more, you could do more stuff that brings you joy or a better quality of life. And they generally agree every time. And, results have varied. Sometimes they've taken maybe another trip or two, but they've not moved the needle as far as they probably should. And we've reached the point where we've essentially said, right, do you agree it'd be productive and better for your quality of life if you took more trips, flew first class, stayed in nicer places, whatever it is? Yes. Do we agree, since you have some trips coming up, that we could start just rounding some stuff up, right? We're going to fly, business instead of economy, so on and so forth. Yes, we do. Okay. Can we agree then that if you don't do that, and the way that we're going to measure that is that if you don't start leveling off the amount of cash you're accumulating because you're not spending enough of it, and so you just keep accumulating a big pile of cash, that we, at the very least, if you don't do that, will go ahead and at least take it out of the cash accounts and invest it in some way, shape, or form, so that the problem, right, and this is all about the quality of life thing, right? I can't force you to fly first class. I can't force you to take more trips. But can we at least agree then that the secondary problem of that, which is this overaccumulation of cash, should be solved by me coming in and saying, I am going to tell you at our next meeting or at this benchmark, you are going to need to invest this chunk of it. And if you do so, that at least is more productive than the current secondary effect of not spending your ample abundance of cash. All right, so that's a sequence of, do we agree about this course of action? Do we agree this is a reasonable time frame? And if reasonable action does not happen in a reasonable time frame, that this is going to be the quote-unquote consequence, a productive consequence, but a consequence that at least moderates the negative impacts of your failure to take action on this.
So you're kind of creating like forcing mechanisms to kind of be like, okay, if we don't do this by this date, this will be what happens, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a ramification. And again, it should be positive oriented. It's not, if you don't spend the money, then you have to cut me a personal check and I'm just going to take your money. Like, sure. That's not productive. That's not okay. Mm-hmm. But it's just saying, like, look, we have agreed, right, that this would be an improvement to your life. I think you should do it. I'm going to create a quote-unquote consequence, which is that if you don't spend it on your quality of life, then I will at the very least put it to more productive use for you, so that at least it's not causing a secondary problem of just being kind of uninvested, useless cash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, feel free to leave this in or not. I had a buddy once, and he was dating a girl, and let's just say it wasn't a good relationship for either side. Like, it was unhealthy. He knew the thing needed to be broken apart, but he, it's easy to kind of do what you've been doing every day, which is not breaking up with the person and just kind of living your life. So he got me to a point where he's like, dude, like I really need to follow through on this. So I said, okay, how about this? I said, take what's a reasonable time frame in which you think you can muster up the courage to have this conversation with this partner. Say it was a month. I said, okay, cool. You know what you're going to do? You're going to, a month out from today, write a dated letter with you breaking up with her. Give me the letter. I'm not going to mail the letter to her. But in that time, if you do not have the conversation with her, I will mail the letter. And it forced him to kind of have the conversation with the partner. And I never mailed the letter. I don't think I would have had the courage to do so anyways, but it similar to this, in maybe a less positive way, it kind of forced him to have the uncomfortable conversation in the same way with a client. You probably say, hey, can we agree this is a mutually beneficial thing for you? Okay, now that we've made that agreement, what's a reasonable time frame to do the thing, to not do the thing, etc. Okay, and if it's not done or is done by this date, what is the recourse or the thing in which we now do, I guess.
Yep. And I mean, you've seen even the letter is a good example, right? We had a client where one had retired, one had not retired, and they definitely could have both been retired already. And the one had this sort of project oriented job where they kept saying like, "Well, I want to stick it out," but then there was always this overlap where before the current project was done, the next project would be getting geared up, and so they just felt obligated over and over again to stick around for the next project. And it turned into a case where essentially, the client had to write a letter of resignation and give it to the spouse, and essentially said like, "You have until the middle of this year to retire and give your notice, or I will retire you, right, on your behalf." So I mean, there's just ways to get around that. Where at the end of the day, like it's an extreme accountability mechanism, and that's not the place you want to start. You don't want to start with extreme accountability, but again, if we can agree that certain things should happen and need to happen, sometimes that is going to be the mechanism that's required, is something that forces the issue or creates an alternative positive consequence.
What do you think's harder? Like, there's certain recommendations that just need to continue to be done. Like, it's not a do it once, check it off the box. But then there are like check it off the box things. Like, do you find that one tends to be harder for clients to implement and follow through on than the other?
I think ongoing is harder because it requires habit, right? To repeatedly and regularly go through it. I also think that check off the box stuff is easier because it can be either sequential over time or it can be done all at once. I mean, there's a motivation thing and there's a certain demographic of client, and everybody knows these people or are these people in their own lives, right? Where they can never get something done, but when they do get it done, they get it all done at once, right? Like they don't clean their house on a regular basis, but every 3 months they just clean the entire house and really go deep. And house looks great for 2 or 3 weeks, and then it kind of falls apart for another couple of months, and then they really clean it again, so on and so forth. So it's that sort of thing where I think one-time things are almost intrinsically always easier because ongoing requires systems, it requires habits, it requires a way to track and make sure that it is still happening on a going basis. That's frankly fundamentally one of the big reasons why coaches, why personal trainers, why financial planners have a livelihood doing what they do, is because a lot of people just need accountability. They need help with that. And it's hard. Like nobody goes to a personal trainer and says like, I'm not buying accountability. What I'm buying is somebody to give me a great exercise program to get great traps. Well, sure. But also a big part of what you're paying for is somebody who will give you crap if you don't show up at the gym to work on building those traps. Mm-hmm. So that is just the big thing. I think ongoing is always more difficult.
This might be like it depends on the person answer, but when I think about momentum, right, and small wins kind of snowball into bigger wins over time. You mentioned the people that might tackle things slowly and methodically over time, and they get to a certain point by a certain date. And then there's the other people who kind of do it all one day, right, and they plow through it. In terms of healthy habit creation and getting the things done, do you find that one is more productive and better than the other? Or it's more of like, look, whatever works for you, if you still check it off the box, like, fine.
I think it's really, really individually tailored. If I have to pick one over the other, I prefer the snowball over the avalanche, to use sort of the debt pay down analogy. Snowball being I'd rather stack up lots of small sequential wins building up to a greater crescendo than try to just drown it all and do it all at once. Because it's one thing to just say like I spent one afternoon really getting after it, and then that problem was solved or that was done, and now I don't think about it anymore. It's different if I worked on something every week, I worked on something every week, because even if I finish everything eventually, I still spent the last several weeks, several months, several years, whatever it was, sequentially working on this, building that habit muscle versus just the Herculean willpower of doing it all at once. It's always individualized. Some people really just only have the time, energy, or attention to do it all at once in certain periods. But if I have to pick one and I can get somebody to adopt one, I'd rather that they did stuff sequentially over time and built that habit muscle.
All right. Yeah, I think that exhausts the questions I had for you this week, Dan.
Well, then you know what my question is going to be, Daniel. What have you learned this week? And for that matter, maybe over the whole holiday break here that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, well, the good thing about the break is like it allows me to kind of step back and think about some of these topics a little bit more of like with a little bit more time and maybe consideration than when we do it on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And some of these actually were more or less topics that came up with friends and family and folks over the break. And it kind of relates to this one. So I was speaking with, we'll call him a buddy. And they would agree they're objectively not well off. They're still just young enough that they haven't amassed wealth yet. And they've had a task that I gave them, a couple months ago, and they finally got it done a couple weeks ago. And if I told you the task, you'd say that's something I can genuinely do in probably 5 minutes while I'm eating my lunch today. And it is. But this person did the task, and it was a financial related task. And it was funny because at the end of the year, they're like, yeah, no, I got my finances in order. Like, things are moving on the up and up. And there's a lot of people out there that would probably beat them up and say, dude, all you did was like figure out how to log into an account that's 4 years old. Like, it's not that big of a deal. But it is a big deal because it's positive momentum in the right direction, right? And I think a lot of us get hung up, well, the numbers aren't big. Yeah, sure, it went up, but it's not a lot. Or, yeah, I know I did something productive today, but it wasn't all that, right? And I get beating yourself up over that, but at the same time, like, that's how habits are started, right? I think I've used this before. I had a buddy who wanted to go to the gym with me, and I used to tell him, like, just go to the gym. You don't even have to work out. Like, just go for a week. And he's like, well, that doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense. And I'm like, yeah, well, you get in the habit of showing up, walking into the gym, and then if you're there, yeah, sure, you might as well work out because you're already there, but I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking you to go for a week. And if you could do that, then next week maybe we'll start to exercise. And it's kind of the same with logging into accounts and whatnot, saving, automating things. Like, small progress is still progress. And as you mentioned, right, those small tasks or snowballs that turn into bigger snowballs over time, which could one day become, quite large snowballs. So,
yeah, I'll say every step in the right direction makes a difference.
I could have just said that. So,
well, glad to hear from you, Daniel. And again, Happy New Year.
You too. Thanks.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.